Tonight, you're all here to see Craig Pittman, and Craig is a native Floridian. He's a best-selling author, a podcaster, and award-winning environmental reporter. In 40 years as a newspaper reporter, he covered a variety of beats and quite a few natural disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, and the Florida legislature. After 31 years at the Tampa Bay Times, he now writes a weekly column on environmental issues for the Florida Phoenix and is co-host of the popular podcast, Welcome to Florida. He's the author of 7 non-fiction books about what he calls the most interesting state, including the New York Times bestseller, Oh Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country. The Florida Heritage Book Festival named him a Florida literary legend in 2020, and in 2022 he was given the Rachel Carson Award by the National Sierra Club. Please join me as we welcome Craig Pittman.
The book is based on a series of blog posts I did for Slate and in 2013, and the book is divided up into sections by categories, by different topics. So there's a chapter about what it's like to grow up in Florida. There's a chapter about what the beach is like in Florida and why it's so important. There's a chapter about driving in Florida. There's a chapter about gambling in Florida. No, those are not the same chapter. And after I turned in the book, and after it was too late to make any changes in it, one day I was driving my son home. Oh, and I should mention that the last chapter of the book is basically how weirdness is wherever you look in Florida if you know what to look for. And so it sort of goes through, as an example, it goes through things I would see on my way taking my kid home from school. I'd go up and pick him up, and then on the way home we'd pass by the house where the case of the naked nanny occurred. We'd pass by a building that was hit by a runaway blimp, and we passed by a city structure that at one point had a pirate ship anchored next to it, and the pirate ship had been used in both the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and also a porn movie, and the city was not happy about that second one. So after I turned in the book, and it was too late to make changes, one day I'm driving my son home from school, the same route that I had mentioned in the book, and we pass by a museum downtown in St. Petersburg, and there's a banyan tree out front, and there's a woman up in the banyan tree who has her blonde hair in dreadlocks, and she's wearing this colorful Eastern European costume, and she's somehow gotten an accordion up there, and she's playing and singing John Denver songs at the top of her lungs. And I saw that and I thought, that's odd. And so I pointed it out to my son. I said, hey, do you see that woman who's up in the tree with the accordion playing and singing John Denver songs? Why do you think she's doing that? And he said, Dad, it's Florida, who knows? And I said, we are raising you the right way. I have to tell you that we've been weird like this for a long, long time. A lot of my friends who are from Florida insist that, no, we weren't weird till all those Yankees moved down here. And I have to tell them, no, it's not true. Even before we were a state, we were known as a rogue's paradise. And a visitor who came here in the 1830s said that it seemed to him that half the population were scalawags and robbers and the other half were penniless victims. And so, not much has changed, really. The first flag that flew over the state capitol in 1845, actually, the first state flag actually said, "Leave us alone," on it. Did people pay attention? No, they did not. It was either a wish or a warning. I'm not sure which. All right, so the most interesting state, yes. We have more first magnitude springs than anywhere else in the world. And our first magnitude referring to how much water gushes up from the aquifer underground. In fact, the pioneering naturalist William Bartram, when he came here and wrote about our springs, it actually inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem about Kubla Khan and the caverns measureless to man. We also have more fake dinosaurs in the United States. Many of them located at Dinosaur World on I-4. Have you guys ever been to Dinosaur World? They used to have 200 dinosaurs there. Now they only have 199 because somebody stole one. We don't know why, and we don't know how. We just know it answers to the name of Rex, so just keep your eyes peeled for that. We have the nation's smallest post office. It's a former tool shed in a Chope. It's just big enough for the stamps. And we have the nation's, that's the nation's smallest post office. The smallest police station is a phone booth in Carabel, and I'm still amazed that they still have a phone booth. That's just me. And I always like to mention the town that was founded by a group of Russian circus midgets. That's Sweetwater down in Miami-Dade County. Their bus broke down, and they figured this is the right place to build our little tiny homes. So you can see why I call it the most interesting state. And there's the flag I mentioned. Let us alone. Yeah. Our first U.S. Senator claimed he was descended from Moroccan royalty. Actually, he was just Jewish, and he didn't want anybody to know. Our pioneers, though, they knew things about the state that we tend to have forgotten. One of the things they knew was that it was really hot here without air conditioning, so they named a lot of places after hell. There's Tate's Hell Swamp, there's Lake Helen Blazes, there's the Devil's Mill Hopper in Gainesville. And the first working air conditioning system, sort of, was invented by a Floridian, a guy named Dr. John Gorey in Apalachicola, who wanted to cool down his yellow fever patients. So he invented a way to blow air over ice and cool them down. And of course, this was such a visionary invention that he died penniless. Often the people who lived here as pioneers did something illegal for a living. They poached alligators, they lured ships onto the rocks, and then they'd loot them. My favorite example comes from my hometown of Pensacola. Back when a lot of the ships were made out of wood, the Navy cultivated forests to use, to build new ships or to repair the ships. And so the U.S. Marshal for Pensacola wrote to his boss and said someone was sneaking onto the oak forest in Pensacola and cutting down the trees and dragging them away. And he said, and I can't do anything about it because half the grand jury's involved. And they also knew that life here could seem totally random. In the 1800s and early 1900s, nobody had any use for the beach. Why go to the beach? All the things we do, the farming and so forth, happens beyond the beach. But along the coastline, people would go to the beach to look for things that had washed up on shore, random things. And they would find, cookware, they'd find wood, they'd find food that had washed up. In one example, from a little further south from here, they actually found a ship that was filled with 300 coconuts. And they said, well, what can we do with that? So they planted them, and that's how Palm Beach got its name. True story. True story. The other thing the pioneers knew that we tend to have forgotten is that Florida is trying to kill us. Constantly trying to kill us. We are the sinkhole capital of America. There are more sinkholes that happen here than anywhere else. The one in the picture happened in Mulberry in the 80s. It was so big people joked that it was the new Disney ride, Journey to the Center of the Earth. And about 10 years later, they had another one about 1.5 miles from there that it was even bigger. We're the lightning capital of the Western Hemisphere. More lightning strikes happen here. And there's actually a professor at the University of Florida who studies lightning strikes. And if I had known about this when I was in school, I would have followed in his footsteps, because he builds model rockets and flies them into storm clouds trying to attract lightning, that's got to be the coolest job ever, frankly. We are the shark bite capital of the world. More people get bitten by sharks in Florida than anywhere else, including Australia. I think because we taste so good, but that's just me. And we have the most hurricanes making landfall in the United States. And of course, we're a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water, so we are right on the front lines of climate change and a rising sea level. So you add all that together, we've got the sinkholes, the lightning, the shark bites, the hurricanes, the rising sea levels, and of course that creepy clown college in Sarasota. And you got to figure that Florida is really, really out to get us. But, we call it paradise, and we tell the tourists, come down and visit us. Come down and join us. A lot of the weird news stories you see about Florida involve our animal population. Florida actually has more exotic invasive species than any other state. we're obviously familiar with the pythons, but the list of invasives also includes tegus and other creatures. The tegu, you may not be familiar with that. It's a really big lizard, basically, with a really nasty temper. And I talked to a guy in Tampa. One morning he said he was taking the garbage out, and he sort of sensed there was a presence near him, and he turned around and there was a tegu, and it started hissing at him, and it scared him so bad that now his wife has to take the garbage out. My favorite ones are the giant African land snails, or gals for short. They wound up invading the Miami-Dade County area, and they're voracious. They eat 500 different types of fruits and vegetables. They're as big as your hand, and they're hermaphroditic, so they breed prodigiously, all by themselves. And the state actually became so alarmed that it bought and trained dogs to sniff out the snail mucus to get rid of them. And I always felt bad for the dogs, because you figure they'd go back to the kennel at night and the other dogs are bragging, "Hey, I sniffed out some drugs today. How about you?" "Oh, I sniffed out a bomb. How about you?" "I sniffed out some snail mucus." It's a living. But the way we got the giant African land snails is that a religious cult in Miami smuggled them in from Africa, thinking that drinking the snail mucus would make you healthy. It actually had the opposite effect, which is how the authorities found out that they were here. And one woman in particular smuggled a bunch of them in under her dress. She got on a plane in Nigeria and flew to Miami. And I picture the guy sitting next to her going, "Ma'am, did you know your dress is slowly undulating back?" During one weekend, a lot of people incidentally buy and keep exotic pets as a lifestyle choice, which doesn't make sense to me, but I saw it in my neighborhood. We actually had a neighbor who owned a couple of emus, and they would get out at least once a month. And one of my kids says his favorite childhood memory is watching the emus running down the street and then watching the neighbors chasing after them. All it was missing was the Benny Hill music. But in the same weekend in Florida, we had a runaway llama in Leon County that was tasered by the cops, and then because they didn't know how else to capture it. It's not like they covered that in the police academy. And then we had a runaway kangaroo in Pasco County, and they tried tasering it, and that didn't work. So finally, a guy who'd been a high school wrestler just tackled it. We've also had problems with native wildlife, but not because of the native wildlife, but because of people. We actually have had problems with people jumping on manatees and sea turtles. The big manatee one was a woman was at St. Pete Beach. She was swimming, and a manatee swam up to be with the people. They're friendly creatures, and everybody was like, "Oh wow, look at this cool manatee!" And this woman jumped on its back and started riding it like it's a carousel horse. And people were like, no, get off the manatee, leave it alone. And she didn't. So what was the reaction? Everybody pulled out their phone and took pictures and video that then circulated around the world. The cops tracked her down. They gave her what's basically a slap on the wrist for what she did. I think her real punishment is that pictures of her thighs flashed around the world. And then we build our houses in alligator, bear, and panther habitat, and people are surprised when they show up in our backyard. It's like, oh, you're here too? Oh, well, they were here first, actually. The bear and panther stories are great. The bear stories in particular, because they'll show up and get in your hammock, or they'll chill out by the hot tub. But the gators are my favorite, because they'll show up at 4 a.m. like your drunk uncle and start banging on the door with their tail, like, "Hey, let me in." But the gators, I actually know of 3 different instances where alligators helped to capture runaway criminals. Talk about taking a bite out of crime. But we have a lot of natural wonders in Florida. Our state park system, for instance, is incredible. It's won 4 national awards, which is 3 more than any other state. And includes, we're the only state with a list of government jobs includes mermaid, because Weeki Wachee Springs, anybody here been to Weeki Wachee? Yeah, it's cool, it's very cool. They started in 1947, a guy named Newt Perry bought this property, cleaned out all the old refrigerators and hubcaps and stuff people have been throwing in there, and then built an underwater theater and hired local women to pull on these 60-pound prosthetic tails and swim around and wave at the tourists. And it was so popular, Elvis came to visit, a whole bunch of other people like that. But then around the 2000s, business started to tail off. And so it went up for sale. And instead of letting it go to a developer or a water bottler, the state actually stepped in and bought the spring and turned it into a state park, which has led to some interesting discussions about the use of tax dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. But I have to say, the first National Wildlife Refuge was at Pelican Island on this coast. There was an island that pelicans used to flock to by the thousands, and a guy living on an island next door thought it was wonderful, and then he saw people start showing up with guns and blasting away and killing the pelicans. Because around 1900, the fashion for ladies' hats was to use feathers from actual birds to decorate the hats. And so Florida's birds just got killed by the thousands. They went after the ibis and the roseate spoonbills, the flamingos, you name it. And so he contacted a fledgling organization called the Audubon Society and said, we need to do something about this. And they agreed. They approached President Teddy Roosevelt, and he wrote an executive order declaring Pelican Island to be the very first National Wildlife Refuge, no hunting allowed. So the folks in charge said, well, we need someone to serve as like the game warden there to keep an eye on it. Hey, how about that guy who first complained? So he got a job out of his warning about the need to protect it. And it worked great for 20 years, and then there was a very Floridian twist, which is a hurricane came along and all the birds left. And so his boss said, I'm sorry, we don't need you anymore, you're fired. But then the birds came back, so it was okay. And I always have to mention Nat Reed, a Florida man. He is the guy who co-wrote the Endangered Species Act. He grew up in Jupiter. His mother said he loved fly fishing so much he actually emerged from the womb with a fly rod in his hand. He was a Deputy Secretary of the Interior under Richard Nixon, and there was a lot of concern among biologists about the decline in important species, panthers, manatees, key deer. And so he got together with some friends over Chinese food in Washington, and in between bites of mugu gai pan, they sketched out the plans for what became the Endangered Species Act and got it passed by Congress and got their boss to sign it. And I have to mention that one of the species on that first endangered species list was alligators. They were once considered a rare species. Now, they're everywhere you see anything bigger than a puddle, it's got an alligator in it. So they're definitely an endangered species success story. In fact, the state now has a program where they'll send trappers out in case an alligator has gotten too close to somebody's little yip dog. And this is called the Statewide Nuisance Alligator Program, or SNAP for short. So if anybody tells you bureaucrats don't have a sense of humor, tell them about SNAP. The list of weird stories often includes Florida's politicians, because they're weird too. This actually he was the president of the Senate at the time, Dempsey Barron, when a Weeki Watching Mermaid came to visit. Probably my favorite Florida politician is Governor Sidney Katz, who was elected on a prohibition ticket and claimed that the Pope had sent Catholic hitmen to kill him, and so he always wore a pair of 6 guns. And he would end his speeches by saying, the Florida cracker only has 3 friends, Jesus Christ, Sears and Roebuck, and Sidney J. Katz. There is an often forgotten story about the mayor of Cedar Key in 1890 who actually set that place up as like an island dictatorship. He hired a thug as his town marshal, and the two of them would walk around with shotguns, and they would make people do crazy stuff just for their own amusement. Hey, you two guys, headbutt each other. Yeah, that's it. Ha ha. And then they'd walk on. And people were terrified. And so a woman wrote to President Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, and said, you've got to help us, we're under a reign of terror. And if you look this up in old New York Times, it actually has reign of terror in the headline. And so about that time, the mayor and his town marshal beat up the keeper of the customs house, who's a federal employee. And so the president dispatched a Navy cutter to arrest the mayor of Cedar Key, which, as far as I can tell, is the only time American armed forces have invaded an actual American island. But they invaded, the mayor ran away. Why Cedar Key doesn't have an annual celebration of this to recreate it, and sell popcorn that you could throw at the mayor as he runs away, I think that'd be a big seller. I really do. Unless you think all these stories about weird politicians are old stories, in 2016 we had a candidate for U.S. Senate who actually boasted that he drank goat's blood as part of a pagan sacrifice. I asked him what the blood tasted like, and he said, fame. He didn't win, by the way. But one of the other candidates, he was a libertarian candidate, one of the other candidates was married to a woman that he accused of committing bigamy, and her trial on that charge wound up having to be postponed because one of her breast implants sprung a leak. That is not a story you would see in any other state. I have to tell you the ultimate Florida politics story, which involves U.S. Senator Gary Hart, who's not from Florida, he's from Colorado, and was running for president, and word got around that he was not faithful to his wife, and so he held a press conference and said, I'm a boring guy, follow me around. I challenge you to follow me around. So the Miami Herald said, okay, we'll do that. So they actually put reporters to stake out his place in Washington and found a woman coming out at a time when his wife was not there, and she was an actress from Florida, and so it became a huge story. They had got him doing this, and then things kind of died down, but then a picture emerged, and a newspaper printed the picture, and it showed the actress sitting on the senator's lap, and behind them was a boat, and the name of the boat was The Monkey Business. And people had a field day. His presidential campaign was toast after that. And I mention all this because the newspaper that first published that picture was not the Miami Herald, it was the National Enquirer, which at the time was based here in Florida, based in Lantana. And the guy who started it was a former CIA employee named Generoso Pope Jr. His godfather was literally the godfather, Frank Costello, the godfather of the New York mob, and loaned him the money to buy the paper and convert it into a tabloid. Generoso Pope Jr. was very careful with a dollar, let's say. He would actually go out and measure the height of the lawn in front to make sure the lawn care people were cutting it to the right height. And so at a time when a lot of newspapers were converting from black and white to color, he didn't want to throw away the black and white presses. So instead, he started a new publication called the Weekly World News that was totally in black and white, and also they didn't bother much with fact checking. And so the Weekly World News, which, by the way, if you saw the movie Men in Black, they refer to it as the most accurate news source in the world. They're the ones that told us that Elvis was still alive, that a bat boy was living in a cave in Kentucky, and that space aliens had come down here to endorse candidates in our political races. Who knows if it's true? But I have to tell you about a slightly more serious publication, Florida Today. A guy named Al Newharth saw all the work that was going into building the space program in Brevard County and realized there was not a daily newspaper serving Brevard County. And he said, here's a huge opportunity. There's going to be a lot of people moving in. We need to get in on this. And he convinced his bosses at Gannett to let him start a new daily newspaper called Florida Today. Actually had like a little satellite imagery around the O in Today. And it was the first one. It was a color newspaper, and everything was in color, very bright, popping color. And all the stories were really short. There were lots of listicles. So a lot of the news things that you see now were first pioneered there, and it did so well that Al eventually got promoted to chairman of Gannett and started USA Today, modeled on Florida Today. Now there's a chapter of the book that you wouldn't want to read while you're in Sunday school. It's the one called The Sunshine State, because there's a lot of monkey business going on besides Gary Hart. Back in the 20s, a lot of promoters used sex to sell the Florida real estate to the Yankees. Carl Fisher, who took mangrove islands in South Florida and basically dumped a lot of sand on them and called it Miami Beach. He's the one who would pay women to dress up in what were then considered risque bathing suits and take pictures of them in February and send those to the northern newspapers, and where the ladies would go, oh my, look at these hot pictures, and the men would go, yeah, look at those hot pictures. And it would attract tourists down here, and eventually they would buy the real estate. An even better ploy was used by promoters in St. Petersburg, who invented a ladies' purity league, who supposedly were complaining to the mayor about the sea nymphs who were dressing in scandalous outfits out at the beach and stealing their husbands. So the next time you're at the beach, look out for those sea nymphs. But I have to tell you, the sin actually does work, because Betty Page was made famous by a Florida photographer named Bunny Yeager. Bunny was herself a former pinup model and figured out she could make more money as a photographer than as a model, especially since she made the clothes that they then stripped out of when she was taking the pictures. So she's the one who took all the first early pictures of Betty Page, and made her a big star, and actually got a fledgling magazine called Playboy interested in her. And then Deep Throat, the most famous X-rated film, was actually filmed here in Florida with backing from the mafia, of all things. Florida has more nudist resorts than any other state, for obvious reasons. It's warm here, so why not take off all your clothes? And the range of nudist resorts available goes from the high-end, expensive ones, like Caliente, to the ones that are a little more working class, let's say. The name Bare Buns Biker Club, which just sounds like a bad idea to me. The word chafing comes to mind. But at one point, I think it was Hurricane Irma was headed this way, and my boss said, I want you to call around. This is when I was working for the newspaper. My boss said, call around to different places and see if they're taking any evacuees. So I called Caliente and said, are you taking any of the evacuees? And they said yes, and the good news, you don't have to pack any clothes. And of course, where you have sin, of course, you also have to have salvation. So there's a chapter about religion in Florida. We have the famous statue, Christ of the Abyss, that's underwater in the Keys, in case you want to worship while you're snorkeling or scuba diving. The mayor of Inglis, a town north of Tampa, in 2001, actually issued an order banning Satan from her town and put a copy of the resolution on all four corners of the town boundaries. It did not keep out all the reporters who came to do stories about it. In Miami, they have a group of janitors known as the Voodoo Squad, who actually go in each morning and clean up all the Santeria sacrifices that are, the dead chickens and so forth that are left on the courthouse steps to attempt to influence different cases. Again, not a story you'd read in any other state, only Florida. And probably the most prominent example of religion in the news in Florida. Do you guys remember Jim and Tammy Faye Baker? Yeah. Jim Baker fooled around with a church secretary in Clearwater, at the Clearwater Sand Key Resort. That's where they met and had their assignation, I guess you'd say. And of course, once it got out, his whole empire crumbled. Tammy Faye cried a lot. Here's the crazy thing is, now this was pre-internet, so there are no emails, but people called and wrote letters to the Sheraton Sand Key Resort asking if they could buy the sheets, the pillowcases, the shower curtains. I think this is one of those examples where the world went crazy and Florida went, what's wrong with you people? Probably the most prominent religious figure to get in trouble in Florida, though, was Martin Luther King. He was actually busted in St. Augustine while he was leading a civil rights protest that ultimately led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There were lots of marches, lots of conflicts with the Klan, and at one point he led marchers to the stairs leading into one of the town's most prominent hotels, and said, I'd like to come in and eat a meal. And the owner said, no, you can't come in. This is for whites only. And he said, I have a right as an American to come in here and be served. And they said, no. And they called the cops. The cops came and arrested him on the steps. And so he was not able to go in. And fast forward about 25 years, the hotel is up for sale. The Hilton people come in and buy it. And they announce plans to tear down the hotel and build a brand new Hilton. Isn't that great? And all the historic preservation people said, no, you can't do that. That's where Martin Luther King got arrested. That's a historic thing that we need to recognize, and you need to recognize in whatever you build. So they went back and forth. There was lots of lawsuits filed. They went to mediation, and ultimately they came up with what I think is a very Floridian solution, which is they tore down the hotel, but they kept the steps. So if you go to St. Augustine, you can stand on the very steps where Martin Luther King got arrested, but you can't go into the restaurant because it's not there anymore. Speaking of people being arrested in Florida, obviously a lot of the Florida man stories you see are about people who got arrested for doing crazy stuff. My favorite one is the guy who threw an alligator through a drive-through window in Loxahatchee just because he thought it would be funny. He wasn't laughing after they arrested him, though. We get a lot of those crazy crooks. And in fact, it's to the point that the TV show Cops was first filmed in Florida. The whole first season was set in Fort Lauderdale. And I'm sure people watching it went, wait, that's not real, is it? And also I should mention that our concealed weapons law and our stand your ground law were copied by a lot of other states, but we were the first ones to have them. People always ask me about this picture, by the way. This is a guy who tried to assassinate FDR in Miami Beach. And as you can see, he's somewhat challenged in the height category. So he stood in a chair, and a woman standing next to him realized what he was doing and beat the crap out of him with her purse and saved the president's life. So there you go. And by the way, he wound up at Rayford, and they executed him. And he's buried there, and I went and found his grave. They actually spelled his name wrong on the grave marker. And the grave marker, which by the way is made out of a license plate, because that's what they do with grave markers at the state prison. All the grave markers are license plates. But I have to tell you that a couple of crooked cops in Florida, and Lord knows we have plenty of those, actually led to a big courtroom revolution. These two guys, they were walking the beat in the business section of Miami Beach, and they would do that during the daytime, and then at night they'd go back and burgle the businesses. One of them would stand outside and be the lookout, and the other one would go in and rifle the cash register. And they kept in contact with each other through walkie-talkies. And so one night, a guy living in the neighborhood who was a big ham radio fan couldn't sleep, and so he turned on his radio and he picked up their radio transmissions, and he realized what he was hearing and started tape recording it. And then he took the tape recording to the cops. Of course, the cops listened to it, recognized the voices. Oh my God, it's Bert and Ernie, and arrested them. And it's a pretty open and shut case. But here's the thing: is the case actually got appealed all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, because this was the time when they were having the very first experiments with allowing TV cameras in the courtrooms. And the TV cameras were there not for very long, but they showed just enough of the trial that their attorney argued that prejudiced the jury against them and led to them voting to convict. And so the case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court. All kinds of media organizations filed friend of the court briefs, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that if you're doing something wrong, you have no expectation of privacy. So there you go. And that meant that you could have cameras in courtrooms. I'm sorry, that was a U.S. Supreme Court, not Florida Supreme Court. That was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. So cameras were allowed in courtrooms all over the country, except the Supreme Court, which still doesn't allow cameras inside the court. Go figure. But it's all because of two crooked cops and a guy who couldn't sleep who had a ham radio. Now, as I mentioned, there's a chapter about driving in Florida. We are generally ranked as having the worst drivers in America, but I contend it's because we have all the drivers in America. They're all here at the same time, and that's why they're all clogged up on the interstate. But we really do have some of the best road rage stories. My favorite one is from Gainesville. The headline said, "Man in road rage incident runs over self." And the best car crash stories. There was a woman who was driving in the Keys. She was on the 7 Mile Bridge. For some reason, she had her ex-husband in the car with her, even though she was headed for a date. And so she asked her ex-husband to take the wheel while she got ready for the date, and then pulled a razor out of her purse and began shaping up what the newspapers later referred to as her bikini area while the car was moving. And do I really need to tell you the rest? I mean, you can probably figure it out. Anyway, this inspired the Carl Hyacin book, Bikini Girl, yes, and it also got mentioned in Dave Barry's book, Best State Ever, as well as my book. So she made 3 books. I don't know if she made any money on it. I don't know how the date went either. In 2012, there were so many cars in Florida that crashed into post offices that the Postal Service actually ran public service announcements saying, we don't need a drive-through window, we're good, it's okay. Put your brakes on. But that Floridian need for speed is what gave birth to NASCAR. In 1947 in Daytona Beach, a group of guys who really liked driving left, turning left and turning left and turning left, got together and over 3 days put together the rules for what became the stock car racing body. And unlike other professional sports, which are in the hands of a group of owners who appoint a commissioner, NASCAR has always been a family business. It's owned by the France family because Bill France is the guy who got everybody together. So, and occasionally kept order with the use of a handgun. So, you know, it's a very Floridian organization. Now, a lot of people, when I give these presentations, they ask me, what's the ultimate weird Florida story? What's the one that encompasses everything? You know, the nakedness and the unusual animals, and I have to say, we haven't hit that one yet, although some of them read like somebody did Mad Libs. But if we had a Florida Weird Hall of Fame, there's some that would go in on the first ballot. So my nominees would be, there was a guy who, he was in a contest at an animal store to win a python, and the way you won was you ate the most live cockroaches. And the good news is he won, the bad news is he died, and the cause of death was listed as choking on insect parts. And I wondered, how often do they check that box in Florida? Is that a common thing? There's one, you guys, have you ever heard of Gibsonton? It's this town in Hillsborough County where a lot of the people who live there are former circus carnies. And so they're, you know, people with interesting disabilities. And one of them was a guy named Lobster Boy, so named because his hands resembled lobster claws. Lobster Boy did great as long as he was working, but when he retired, he really got on his wife's nerves. She hired a teenage hitman to take him out, and it didn't go well for anybody involved. The trial, ultimately, of her and the hitman, it was literally a circus. Everybody who testified was a circus person. A historic one from 1920, there was a guy in Key West, his name was Carl Castle, but he referred to himself as a Count Von Castle. He was more of a Noah Count. And because it was the Depression, he was working in an X-ray, as an X-ray technician for a doctor, and he fell in love with one of his tuberculosis patients, the beautiful Maria, and his love for her transcended death. By which I mean, after she died, he dug up the body and had relations with it. And then her sister found out and was horrified and, of course, called the cops. But this had been going on for 9 years at the time. And so, ultimately, he was acquitted because the statute of limitations had run out. So, but maybe my favorite one is the one involving the lady in the picture there. It's from Fort Lauderdale. Her name's Kathy Willits. Kathy Willits entertained customers at home for pay, shall we say. What the customers didn't realize is that her husband was in the closet with a video camera and a stack of yellow legal pads on which he took notes about the customer's proclivities. And one day, he thought one of the customers was getting a little too close with his wife, so he called the guy up and left an answering machine message threatening him. And so the guy got scared and called the cops. The cops raided the Willits' home, and that's when they discovered that Mr. Willits was actually Deputy Willits. He was a sheriff's deputy. And so suddenly, of course, this became a huge news story, especially when they learned that there was a client list. And so 9 John Does, that was how the case was styled, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe versus the state of Florida, filed suit to keep the client list private. And some very smart entrepreneurs put out T-shirts for sale that said, "I'm not on the list," and they sold out within an hour. This case actually went to the Florida Supreme Court, which ruled there is no expectation of privacy when you're doing stuff like that. And so the list came out, and as you might expect, the list included at least one politician who'd been fighting against the dirty bookstores, you know, saying we have to help our youth. Yeah. Anyway, the story takes a lot of twists and turns. At one point, their attorney argued that this was actually marital therapy for the couple because she was a nymphomaniac. And that's how she became known as the Naughty Nympho, and this was the Naughty Nympho case. Judge if you want, but they're still together years later. So there you go. Maybe the marital therapy worked, who knows? Now, of course, the main question I hear from a lot of people is, why is Florida like this? Why is it like this? And my friends, they don't even ask anymore. They just shake their head. Because they know that anytime there's a big story that breaks, just something that sounds weird, there's going to be a Florida angle to it. And they're just dreading it. And I tell them, don't dread it, just accept it. For instance, did you guys hear about the woman in New Jersey who got stopped at the airport because she wanted to bring her emotional support peacock on board the plane? The peacock was from Florida. So, but I tell them, don't try to shun those weird things, accept them. And, their reasons for them make sense when you think about it. In 1940, we were the least populated southern state. And now, we are the third most populous state. There are 23 million people living here. Plus, we've got 100 million tourists coming in every year. So you cram that many people together, and they're in a small space. They're not evenly spread over the whole peninsula. They kind of crammed into that 30-mile wide swath along the coast and along I-4 where the theme parks are. So you pack that many people in together in that short a length of time, and they're bound to start chasing each other with machetes and arguing over whose dog pooped on whose lawn, and taking their clothes off. So, and think about who those people are. I mentioned there are former CIA agents who trained. They came back here because they trained for the Bay of Pigs here, and they fell in love with the area, so they came back and sort of took over Sanibel. We got the retired carnies in Gibsonton. We've got the Hooters waitstaff. The very first Hooters was founded in Clearwater. Python wranglers, monkey breeders, spam kings, strip club moguls, and of course we've got 30 electoral college votes. And our tropical climate means we're out doing weird stuff all year long. Weird stuff happens wherever there are people because people are weird. But in a lot of states, people have to stay inside because it gets snowy, So we're out there all year long doing stuff. So, we win. And I actually checked this, and it is true. They sell more machetes in Florida than anywhere else. A machete distributor told me, yes, that Florida is our biggest buyer of machetes, which ruined my theory that they were giving them away at the state line in cups of orange juice. And I have to say, we are consistently ranked 49th among the states for treating mental illness. So all I can say to that is thank God for Texas. So that's why I tell my friends, don't shun the weirdness. Be proud of the weirdness, because I contend that the things that cause the weirdness also spark our creativity and lead to us doing the things that influence the rest of the country. For instance, the list of Florida men includes the inventor of the computer, John Adon-Essoff, who grew up in Mulberry, the place where they had the big sinkhole, but not when he was there. And his dad was a phosphate mining engineer, always had a slide rule on his hip. Young John became fascinated with the slide rule, wound up learning how to use it, experimented with electricity, and wound up inventing the computer that we all use to, play solitaire and order stuff off Amazon now. The founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, actually started his first business in Florida. If it had failed, would we now be dodging drones dropping books on our head? No. And I always have to mention the most popular children's book author you never heard of, Donald J. Sobel, who wrote all the Encyclopedia Brown books. He was from Florida. He worked in Miami. And I always picture him, sitting down to write those Encyclopedia Brown books after reading the morning paper. He was living in Miami during the whole cocaine cowboy craze in the 80s. And, when the Miami Herald would have stories about, with headlines like, drug dealers masquerading as cops, captured by cops masquerading as drug dealers. Or, this was my favorite, there were some drug smugglers who were bringing cocaine in, and a Coast Guard airplane was chasing their plane. And so in order to lighten the load, they started throwing the cocaine out. And a bale of the cocaine tumbled end over end and landed in the middle of a Crime Watch meeting in Homestead and just missed hitting the police chief in the head. And so I picture him reading those stories while he's eating his grapefruit in the morning and then putting the dishes away. And of going off to write another story about Encyclopedia Brown solving a bank robbery because of his knowledge of Civil War trivia. But that's Florida. You know, these are Florida men. And so I always say, you know, who wants to live where it's boring, you know? Embrace the weird. If you want to live someplace where every day the news is the same day after day after day, move to one of those square states out west. Move to Nebraska. But if you want to open the paper every day and go, wow, somebody punched a swan today, then you're in the right place. You should enjoy it, and you should celebrate that weirdness. I have to mention some other Florida books that I've written. Cattail, The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which was a real labor of love, emphasis on the labor part. The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife. And this just came out in March. Welcome to Florida, or WTF for short. True Tales from America's Most Interesting State. All of which are for sale up here, by the way.
So join me as we thank Craig for being here.